The rent notice was pink, the kind of pink that screamed final warning even before Rachel Morgan's eyes could focus on the bold black letters. She stood in the hallway of her aging Seattle apartment complex, soaked from the November rain, one hand gripping the notice, the other juggling a grocery bag that had just split open at the bottom. A can of tomato soup rolled away and clanged down the concrete stairs like a bell tolling doom. Her 7-year-old son, Danny, stood a few steps behind her, clutching his backpack, trying not to look worried. He was getting good at that. Too good. His voice came quietly. "Mom." Rachel forced the words out. "I'm okay." She wasn't. Hadn't been for a long time. The lie tasted familiar, worn smooth by repetition like a stone in her mouth. She unlocked the door with a sharp twist, shoulders tense the way they always were now, the way they'd been since the divorce, since the layoff from the dental office, since everything that mattered had slowly leaked out of her life like air from a punctured tire. The apartment smelled like stale coffee and yesterday's laundry. The flickering light in the kitchen had finally died. Rachel set the ruined bag on the counter, blew out a long breath, and opened the mailbox pile that had gathered over the past few days. Water bills past due, a credit card statement she hadn't opened in 3 months, a coupon for a pizza place they couldn't afford, and then an envelope, cream-colored, heavy paper, embossed in gold with the name James R. Beckett, attorney at law, Spokane, WA. She stared at it, frowning. She didn't know anyone in Spokane, didn't know any attorneys, period. Her life didn't include people who sent letters on expensive stationery. Danny had settled at the kitchen table, pulling out his math homework, tongue poking out in concentration. Rachel broke the seal with a butter knife and pulled out a single thick document. Last Will and Testament of Edward Morgan. The name hit her like a ripple in still water. Edward, her great-uncle, her grandmother's brother. A man she'd only met twice, once when she was 6, again when she was 9. Both times he'd smelled like pine trees and old paper, and he'd given her a silver dollar she later lost in a laundromat. The memory surfaced slowly, dusty and incomplete. She scanned the pages. The will was simple, direct. Edward had died 6 weeks ago. No children, no spouse, no debts. He had left everything to her. Everything, it said, included a house, a property tucked deep in the Cascade Mountains, about 40 miles northeast of Seattle. 47 acres, heavily forested. The house, originally built in 1949, had been empty since Edward moved into assisted living in 2018. Access was limited. No power grid, no internet, only reachable by logging roads that were nearly impassable after snowfall. Rachel's heart thumped once, hard. She didn't have anything. Not savings, not backup, not a plan. Her car was a decade older than Danny. The waitress job barely kept them afloat. And now this, a piece of land, a house, property. It felt like a trap and a miracle all at once. Danny's pencil scratched against paper. "How's homework going?" Rachel asked without looking up. He chewed on the eraser. "I'm stuck on fractions." Rachel folded the document carefully. "You're brilliant at fractions. You know that." She meant it. He was brilliant at a lot of things, especially surviving. The next morning, Rachel called the number on the letter. Robert Hayes's voice was low and gravelly, the kind of voice that came with dark wood offices and years of unspoken things. His words were measured. "Yes, Miss Morgan, I've been waiting for your call." He explained the transfer process quickly. The property taxes were current. There were no liens. The home had been checked quarterly by a management company, but frankly, he said, it's in poor condition. Might be worth more for the land itself. Rachel asked about seeing it. Hayes didn't hesitate. "You'll need to go this weekend. Snow is coming. If you wait, the roads will be shut until spring." She drove to Spokane the next day. Danny came with her because she had no one to watch him and because she'd stopped pretending she could shield him from the realities of their life. The law office sat on a quiet street lined with bare trees and old brick buildings. Inside, the air smelled like leather and lemon polish. Robert Hayes was exactly what his voice suggested. Late 60s, silver hair combed back, reading glasses perched on a nose that had been broken at least once. He stood when she entered, shook her hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive. Behind him, another man leaned against the window frame. Younger, maybe early 40s, with the kind of face that belonged in corporate boardrooms. Sharp jaw, expensive haircut, suit that cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. He straightened when he saw her, eyes flicking from her worn coat to Danny's scuffed sneakers. Hayes gestured. "This is Thomas Caldwell. He's been handling some adjacent property matters." Thomas extended his hand, smile polite, but teeth too white, too perfect. "Miss Morgan, I've heard about your inheritance. Quite the surprise, I imagine." Rachel shook his hand briefly. His palm was smooth, no calluses. It was unexpected. Thomas's smile widened, but didn't reach his eyes. 47 acres of worthless forest, from what I understand. That shack Edward left you is condemned in all but name. You'll spend more on property taxes than it's worth. The words landed like a slap. Rachel felt her spine straighten involuntarily. Thomas continued, tone shifting to something that might have been sympathy if it weren't so obviously rehearsed. "Look, I'm trying to save you trouble. I have a client interested in acquiring rural parcels in that area. I can offer you $5,000. Cash. Today. You sign the deed over, walk away clean, no headaches." Rachel's fingers tightened on the strap of her purse. "It's my family's land." Thomas's expression flickered. Amusement, maybe pity. "Family? Edward was a hermit who squatted in the woods for 70 years. You're a..." He paused, glanced at Danny, recalibrated. "You're facing eviction, Miss Morgan. I can see it on your face. Take the money before you waste it on a pipe dream." The room went very quiet. Hayes shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Rachel's voice came out steadier than she felt. "It's not for sale." Thomas's smile disappeared entirely. He straightened, buttoned his jacket with slow, deliberate movements. "Your funeral. That property has complications you don't understand. Issues with access rights, environmental surveys, historical preservation concerns. Don't say I didn't warn you." He walked past her toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "My uncle will be disappointed. He doesn't like complications." The door closed behind him with a soft click. Hayes exhaled slowly, removed his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Thomas Caldwell is Victor Brennan's nephew." Rachel blinked. "Who's Victor Brennan?" Hayes replaced his glasses. "Former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, very connected, very powerful. If his nephew is sniffing around your property, there's a reason." Rachel sat down slowly in the chair across from Hayes' desk. Danny climbed into the seat beside her, eyes wide and watchful. Hayes slid a folder across the desk. "Everything you need is here. Deed, tax records, keys. The management company reports are included. The house is structurally sound, surprisingly. Edward built it himself after the war, but it's been neglected for years. No electricity, no running water beyond a well and hand pump. You'll need supplies if you're going out there." Rachel opened the folder, stared at the grainy photo of a small cabin surrounded by towering pines. It looked like something from a different century, a different world. Hayes leaned forward, voice dropping. "Miss Morgan, I knew Edward. Not well, but enough to know he was a careful man. If he left this to you, he had a reason. Don't let Thomas Caldwell's threats scare you off before you find out what that reason was." They left Seattle before dawn on Saturday. The clouds hung low, dark and heavy, and the cold had a bite that crept under their coats. Danny sat in the passenger seat of Rachel's battered Honda, bundled in 2 jackets and a knit hat that didn't quite cover his ears. He clutched his backpack like it contained everything that mattered, which Rachel supposed it did: a toy flashlight, a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a comic book with a torn cover. Rachel had packed water, batteries, blankets, the pocket knife her father had given her before he died, and a small emergency bag she always kept stashed in the trunk just in case. Just in case of what, she'd never been sure. Now it felt prescient. After 2 hours on the highway, they turned off onto an unmarked gravel road that groaned beneath the Honda's suspension. Towering pines swallowed the sky on both sides. Frost curled along the edges of the windshield, crystalline and delicate. The road narrowed, wound deeper into forest that seemed to press in from all sides. Then, without warning, the house appeared. It looked like it had grown out of the forest itself, small, squat, pitched roof leaning slightly to the left. The windows were boarded over with graying plywood. The paint had long since peeled away into curled flakes that littered the ground like shed skin. Moss crept up the foundation, green and thick, as if the earth itself was slowly reclaiming what it had lent. Danny pressed his face to the window. "Is that ours?" Rachel's throat was dry. "Yeah, it is." She killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the distant hum of wind threading through branches high above. Rachel opened the door and stepped out. The cold punched her lungs. The air tasted like pine sap and wet earth and something older, something that had been here long before the cabin and would remain long after it crumbled back into soil. The keyring Hayes had given her contained 3 brass keys, tarnished with age. The second one fit the lock. The door creaked open with a groan that sounded like a warning. Inside, the air was stale, earthy. Rachel swept her flashlight across the living room. Dust coated every surface in a uniform gray film. A couch sagged in the center of the room, foam guts spilling through cracked vinyl. The fireplace was choked with old ashes. Everything felt frozen in time, abandoned mid-sentence. But when she entered the kitchen, her breath caught. The pantry shelves were fully stocked. Canned beans, crackers still in sealed packages. Jars of peanut butter lined up like soldiers. Bottled water stacked 3 deep. Rachel reached out, picked up a can of soup, turned it in her hand. The label was clean, barely dusty. Best by July 2026. Her mind spun. Edward had been in assisted living since 2018. 6 years. The management company reports had mentioned quarterly checks, but this wasn't maintenance. This was preparation. Someone had been here recently. Someone had stocked these shelves expecting to return. Danny's voice came from behind her, tentative. "Mom, why is there food if no one lives here?" Rachel set the can down carefully. "I don't know." But that wasn't true. Not entirely. She knew something was wrong, knew the shape of it, even if she couldn't see the details yet. Danny wandered back into the living room. Rachel followed, found him kneeling beside a bookshelf against the far wall. Old volumes lined the shelves, field guides, carpentry manuals, a leather-bound Bible with gilt edges worn smooth. Danny ran his fingers along the back panel of the shelf, then stopped abruptly. "There's a gap here." Rachel crouched beside him. He pointed. Barely visible behind the shelf was the outline of something that didn't belong, a seam in the wall, vertical and precise. She leaned in, adjusting her eyes to the shadows. Not a seam, a door, narrow, vertical, with an iron handle just peeking through the gap. Rachel stood, put both hands on the bookshelf. "Help me push." Together, they nudged it. The shelf scraped across the floor, wood groaning against wood, moving more easily than she expected. It slid a few inches at a time until the door was fully revealed. It looked ancient, the kind of door you find in castles or fallout shelters. Iron handle, reinforced wood, no visible keyhole. The metal was cold enough that Rachel could feel it radiating through the air, a chill that didn't belong to the rest of the house. Danny stepped back. "I don't think we should go down there." Rachel stared at the handle. Her hand reached toward it instinctively, then stopped. Every instinct she had screamed to caution. But underneath that, something else whispered. Curiosity, need, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, Edward had left her something more than a rotting cabin and 47 acres of trees. She let go, took a breath. Let's look at the rest of the house first. The hallway to the bedrooms was narrow and dim. The first bedroom was small, barely enough space for the twin bed, a broken dresser, and a nightstand covered in dust. The second was larger, Edward's probably. Rachel moved carefully, letting her flashlight sweep across faded wallpaper, moth-eaten curtains, and a rusted radiator that hadn't worked in decades. On the nightstand sat a leather-bound notebook. Rachel picked it up gently, as if it might crumble at her touch. The cover was worn smooth, the leather soft with age and handling. She opened it to the first page. Edward's handwriting, neat, precise, slightly slanted to the right. January 4th, 1949. Margaret and I moved in today. The cabin is ours, our sanctuary. The government asked me to guard something. I said yes. I thought it was patriotic. Rachel's heart began to beat faster. She flipped forward. March 17th, 1952. The gold arrived today. 5 men in suits. They said temporary. I believed them. Her hands trembled slightly. June 22nd, 1963. They're not coming back. I realize now I'm not a guardian. I'm a liability they forgot about. Rachel closed the journal, pressed it against her chest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the boarded windows. She walked back to the living room where Danny sat on the floor, comic book open in his lap, but eyes unfocused, staring at nothing. She knelt beside him. We're going to sit on the porch for a bit. I need to think. They sat on the front steps, wrapped in blankets Rachel had brought from the car. Their breath fogged the air in small white clouds. The trees swayed with slow creaks, and somewhere far off a raven called once, sharp and distant. Rachel stared into the forest. There were too many questions. Why had Edward isolated himself? Why the stockpiled food? Why the hidden door? Why her? Why now? Danny leaned his head on her shoulder. Is it okay if I'm a little scared? Rachel smiled faintly, kissed the top of his head. Yeah, me too. They stayed there until the sky began to darken with early winter dusk. The temperature dropped further, biting through their layers. Rachel stood, pulled Danny to his feet. Her voice was quiet but steady. I need to check something inside, just 5 minutes. Stay right here, okay? Danny gave her a look, half afraid, half trusting. He nodded. Rachel stepped back into the house. The shadows inside had deepened, but she knew where to go. Back to the bookshelf, back to the hidden door, back to the chill that called to her. She gripped the iron handle. It was colder than she expected, so cold it almost burned. The door opened with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Stairs descended into blackness. Rachel clicked on her flashlight. The beam sliced through the dark, hitting rough stone walls that dropped lower than she expected. The steps were clean. No cobwebs, no dust. But there were footprints. Fresh ones pressed into dirt that shouldn't have been disturbed in years. She paused at the threshold, heart hammering. Someone had been down here. Recently. The sound came then, barely audible. A soft click. Maybe metal on stone. Maybe nothing. Rachel turned the flashlight upward instinctively. Saw only darkness and rough-hewn ceiling. The silence settled again, heavy and waiting. She looked over her shoulder once more toward the front door, toward Danny. Then she descended. The first step creaked under her boot, but only faintly. The air turned colder with each foot of descent, and the beam of her flashlight seemed to fade as though the darkness below wasn't just the absence of light, but something heavier, denser, something with mass. The staircase was longer than expected, at least 20 feet, maybe more. Stone walls on either side absorbed her breath and threw it back, chilled. The steps were clean, too clean, free of dust and debris and even cobwebs, as if someone had swept them recently. Rachel's heart was loud in her chest, but her feet kept moving. 10 steps, 15, 20. Then the narrow staircase leveled into a small, concrete landing, and that's when she saw it. A steel door, massive, industrial, bolted 5 times across the frame from the outside, like someone had gone to great lengths not just to secure it, but to seal it shut. The surface was flawless, no rust, no age, just thick gray metal with a subtle gleam from the flashlight's beam. Rachel approached slowly. The silence pressed in from all sides. She reached out and touched the first bolt. It was smooth, cold. Her fingers hesitated. What is this doing in a cabin basement? This wasn't a panic room, wasn't a storm shelter. This was something else entirely. She drew in a breath and slid the first bolt free. It moved easily, too easily. The second bolt followed, then the third, the fourth, the final one groaned slightly, and for a moment Rachel considered stopping. Every part of her screamed caution, but curiosity was louder now. So was instinct. This wasn't just a room. This was the reason Edward had left her the house. She gripped the steel handle with both hands and pulled. The door opened without resistance. A rush of air spilled out, not musty, not stale, filtered. clean, cold in a way that didn't belong to nature, a controlled environment. Rachel stepped inside and froze. The words slipped out before she even realized she was speaking. This isn't a basement. It was a vault. The room was huge, at least 30 feet wide, maybe 40 deep. The walls were reinforced concrete paneled with steel. The ceiling was low and braced with industrial beams. In the far corner, thick ventilation ducts hummed faintly, a sound so quiet she'd almost missed it. Light switches lined one wall. Rachel flipped one. Overhead fluorescent tubes flickered to life, bathing the bunker in harsh white light. It revealed everything. Military ration boxes stacked waist-high against the left wall, shelves full of first aid kits, bottled water, gas masks, and sealed packages. A workbench with tools arranged in perfect symmetry, wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, all gleaming as if recently cleaned. And then, against the back wall, crates, large, rectangular, stenciled with faded letters in black paint. U.S. Government, authorized personnel only. Beneath that, dates, 1952, 1956, 1961. Rachel's throat went dry. She spotted a crowbar mounted on the wall nearby, wrapped in wire hooks. She hesitated only a second before grabbing it and crossing to the nearest crate. She wedged the flat end under the lid and pulled. The wood groaned. Nails squealed as they were ripped from decades-old fibers. She opened the crate and peered inside. Wrapped in oiled cloth, rectangular shapes lined up in neat rows. Rachel pulled one out, unwrapped it with shaking hands. Gold, a solid bar of it. Heavy, dense, smooth. Stamped along one side in crisp lettering. Federal Reserve Bank. Certified gold, 99.99%. Serial Nambord FR 1952-04738. Rachel dropped to her knees. She wasn't an expert, didn't know markets or commodity prices beyond what she'd seen on news tickers in passing. But she knew what she was looking at. A single bar could be worth hundreds of thousands. And there were dozens in this crate alone. Other crates stretched along the wall, maybe 10, maybe more. Her mind raced, tried to calculate, gave up. This wasn't just money. This was a fortune. She stood up, turned to the next crate, pried it open. Another bar, then another. She stopped counting at 5 crates. It was overwhelming, like she had stumbled into a dragon's hoard buried beneath a forest no one remembered. But it wasn't the gold that chilled her the most. It was what she found next, a metal footlocker tucked beneath the crates, smaller, padlocked. The key was taped to the side with old masking tape, Edward's handwriting and faded black marker. For the right hands only. Rachel unlocked it with fingers that felt numb, clumsy. Inside were manila folders, dozens of them, yellowed with age, stamped with red ink that had bled slightly into the paper fibers over decades. Classified, Project Cobalt, eyes only. She lifted one out, opened it carefully. The pages inside were typed on an old manual typewriter, the letters slightly uneven, the ink faded but still legible. Transfer orders, signatures, serial numbers for gold bars that matched the ones stacked around her. Approvals from the Department of Treasury, Department of Defense, Central Intelligence Agency. Each document was dated between 1946 and 1964. Every single one detailed the movement of federal gold, millions in assets, diverted to undisclosed secure locations. The language was vague, clinical, references to Operation Fulcrum, Black Wire, and most notably, Project Cobalt. Rachel flipped page after page, her breath coming faster. Names she didn't recognize. Agencies with acronyms that meant nothing to her. But the pattern was clear. Someone had taken government gold and hidden it. Not stolen, diverted. Officially, bureaucratically, with all the proper signatures and seals. And then, at the very bottom of the footlocker, a letter. Simple paper, handwritten in the same precise script she'd seen in Edward's journal. Dated 2017, addressed to whomever finds this. Rachel read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper in the concrete chamber. My name is Edward Morgan. In 1946, I was asked to safeguard a shipment for national security. I was young, Army Ranger. I trusted my country. I believed what they told me. Her hands trembled. They said I was the guardian, the vault keeper, What they didn't tell me was that I was CI. Operation Cobalt was a black fund, untraceable money for coups, assassinations, bribes, things that couldn't appear in any budget, any hearing, any public record. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent. They said they'd retrieve it within 5 years. No one ever came. The people who orchestrated this are either dead or sitting in high places, hiding behind clean hands. Rachel's voice caught slightly, but she kept reading. What they left me wasn't gold. It was evidence of betrayal. And now I'm leaving it to you, Rachel. Her name, right there. Edward had known, had planned this. They will come for it. When they find out you have it, they won't knock. They won't ask. They'll erase. Use this to protect yourself. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone who says they're from the government. Rachel folded the letter slowly. She sat on the concrete floor, surrounded by more money than she'd ever imagined, more danger than she could comprehend, and one chilling certainty. This wasn't about inheritance. It was a time bomb. Someone had kept it ticking for 70 years, and now it was hers. The sound came from above, faint, almost imperceptible. A soft metallic knock, like someone tapping steel, coming from somewhere in the house. Rachel's head snapped up. She grabbed the crowbar in one hand, the footlocker letter in the other, and sprinted for the stairs. Danny. She hit the stairs hard, boots echoing against stone. Her flashlight beam bounced wildly. She reached the top, slipped through the hidden door behind the bookshelf, and her eyes darted around the room. Empty. She ran to the front door, threw it open, bolted onto the porch. Danny was sitting on the steps exactly where she'd left him, hugging his knees to his chest. But he wasn't alone. A man stood at the tree line, tall, thin, wearing a black jacket and dark jeans. He was facing the house directly, unmoving, just watching. Rachel stepped between him and her son, voice sharp. Danny, inside, now. Danny looked up, startled by her tone, but obeyed without a word. He scrambled to his feet and disappeared through the doorway. Rachel backed through after him and slammed the door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place, but it felt like a joke. That man hadn't needed to move. Just standing there had been enough. Danny's voice was small, uncertain. Who is that? Rachel's breathing was hard, ragged. I don't know. Through the gap in the boarded window, she peered out. The man was still there, still staring. Then headlights appeared down the logging road. A black SUV rolled into the clearing and stopped beside Rachel's rusted Honda. The engine cut, the doors opened. Two more people stepped out. A woman with close-cropped gray hair wearing a dark coat. A younger man in a suit that looked absurdly out of place in the frozen forest. They spoke briefly with the man at the tree line. Then together, all three started walking toward the house. Rachel's pulse spiked. She turned, grabbed Danny's shoulder. Pack your bag. Now. He ran toward the bedroom without asking questions. He'd seen that look in her eyes before. The one she didn't use unless things were really, really bad. Rachel ran to the back door, turned the bolt, then dragged a heavy oak table in front of it. The front door thundered with a knock. Firm, polite, a man's voice called out, calm and measured. Miss Morgan, we need to speak with you. It's important. Rachel said nothing. She moved toward the bedroom where Danny was stuffing his comic book and flashlight into his backpack with shaking hands. Another knock. The voice came again. Miss Morgan, we're with the Treasury Department. We have some questions about your great-uncle's property. Rachel's skin turned cold. Edward's letter rang loud in her memory. Don't trust anyone who says they're from the government. She grabbed Danny's coat, yanked the zipper closed on her emergency bag. The windows were too small to climb through. The back door was blocked. The only exit left, the only one that might work, was below. The bunker. Her gut twisted. She didn't want to take her son back into that cold vault surrounded by danger and secrets. But she had no choice. She crouched down in front of Danny, gripped his shoulders. Listen to me, sweetheart. We're going downstairs. It's the safest, well, it's right now. Danny's eyes were wide with fear. What about those people? Rachel's voice was steady, even though her hands weren't. We can't let them find us. Do you trust me? He nodded, shaky but certain. The knock came again, louder this time. Rachel grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the bookshelf. She swung it aside. It moved easily now that she knew how, and the door gaped open like a waiting mouth. They descended into the dark. Rachel flicked on her flashlight. The stairs were as silent as before, the bunker just as untouched. As they reached the bottom, she turned, preparing to bolt the steel door behind them. Then she stopped. The bolts only locked from the outside. The door had been designed to keep things in, or keep others out if closed the right way, but not from within. She couldn't trap them down here. Not if those people found the door and opened it. Her eyes swept the bunker again, searching for anything she might have missed. Then she saw it. A second door. Smaller, narrower, partially hidden behind a stack of storage crates in the far corner. Rachel rushed over, dragging the crates aside with strength born of desperation. The door opened with a rusty shriek that echoed through the vault. Behind it, an escape tunnel. Narrow, reinforced with old timber beams, sloped upward into darkness. Rachel pushed Danny forward. Go. Just keep going. Don't stop. He hesitated, looked back at her. Please. He nodded and crawled inside. Rachel followed, hunched over, the ceiling so low she could barely move without scraping her shoulders against rough-hewn wood. The air smelled of earth and metal. Behind them from above, a sound split the silence. Wood splintering. The front door forced open. Voices echoed through the cabin. Boots on floorboards. Heavy, methodical. They had entered. Rachel's heart pounded. She pushed faster, urged Danny forward. The tunnel twisted, climbed in slow, uneven inclines. Dirt crumbled from the walls with every movement. Her flashlight beam bounced wildly. Then light ahead, faint, gray, filtered through cracks. The tunnel ended at a wooden hatch. Rachel shoved it open and crawled out into a grove of trees 100 yards behind the house. Snow crunched beneath her boots. She pulled Danny out and shut the hatch, hiding it again with dead branches and frozen brush. From here, through the trees, she could see both her car and the SUV. The figures were inside the cabin now, searching, calm, efficient, like they knew exactly what they were looking for. Danny looked up at her, shivering. What do we do? Rachel scanned the clearing. They couldn't drive her car. The engine would give them away instantly. But the SUV sat there, keys probably still in the ignition, like so many people left them in remote areas, trusting isolation for security. She made a split-second decision, one that the woman who followed every rule, who paid bills on time, who apologized for things that weren't her fault, would never recognize. She ran to the SUV, opened the driver's side door as quietly as she could, and climbed in. The keys were there, dangling from the ignition. No alarm. Danny scrambled into the passenger seat. Rachel's hand hovered over the ignition, then stopped. She couldn't leave everything. Not Edward's letter, not the evidence. She jumped out, ran back to her Honda, popped the trunk as quietly as possible, and grabbed the emergency duffel. Cash, burner phone, spare clothes. Then she sprinted back to the SUV and started it. The engine purred to life, smooth and powerful. Voices shouted from inside the cabin. Too late. Rachel hit the gas and tore down the logging road. Behind them, trees blurred into streaks of green and brown. Snow fell harder now, thick flakes that seemed to erase the world behind them. In the rearview mirror, 3 figures burst out of the cabin. One of them raised a hand as if to yell, but no sound carried over the engine. They vanished around a bend. Danny didn't say anything for a long time. Then finally his voice came quiet and small. Where are we going? Rachel didn't look at him. Her hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, bloodless. I don't know, but we can't go home. Not now, maybe not ever. The road stretched ahead, winding through forest that seemed endless. Snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, erasing evidence of their passage. Rachel's mind spun. The gold, the documents, Edward's warning. The people at the cabin who'd come looking without hesitation, without delay, as if they'd been waiting for this moment for decades. She thought about Thomas Caldwell's sneer in the lawyer's office. My uncle will be disappointed. Victor Brennan, former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. It all connected. It had to. Somewhere ahead, the road forked. Rachel took the turn without slowing, heading south, away from Seattle, away from everything familiar. Beside her, Danny pulled his coat tighter and stared out the window at the passing wilderness. His reflection in the glass looked small, fragile, but his jaw was set in a way that reminded Rachel of herself. The same stubborn refusal to break, the same quiet determination to survive whatever came next. She reached over and squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. The forest thinned gradually, giving way to hills and then flatlands dusted with snow. The GPS on the SUV's dashboard blinked, tried to recalculate, gave up. Rachel followed the road on instinct, heading toward the only name she had left. Robert Hayes had mentioned someone, a journalist, Laura Chen, investigative work, national security. Rachel pulled over at a rest stop 30 miles south, grabbed the burner phone from the duffel, and dialed Hayes's number from the business card he'd given her. He answered on the third ring. His voice was sharp, awake despite the late hour. "Rachel, where are you? Are you okay?" Her words came fast, clipped. "I found things in the house. A bunker, gold, documents with government seals, and people came, 3 of them. They said they were from the Treasury Department." Hayes swore quietly. "Jesus Christ, did they hurt you?" Rachel glanced at Danny, who was watching her with wide eyes. "No, but they would have if we'd stayed." There was a pause on the line. Then Hayes spoke again, his tone different now. Urgent. "You need to disappear. Right now. Don't go home. Don't contact anyone else. Not family, not friends, no one." Rachel leaned against the SUV, felt the cold metal through her coat. "I don't know where to go." Hayes was quiet for a moment, then, "There's someone I trust. Laura Chen, investigative journalist. She's been looking into Cold War black ops for years. If there's anyone who can help you and keep you alive, it's her." Rachel pulled out a pen from the duffel, wrote on her palm, "Give me her number." Hayes rattled off digits. Rachel repeated them back to confirm. Before he hung up, Hayes added one last thing. "Rachel, don't use your real name, not even for motel sign-ins. Don't think of yourself as Rachel Morgan anymore." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Who am I then?" Hayes's reply was immediate. "Someone they can't find." The line went dead. Rachel stood there in the cold, phone still pressed to her ear, watching Danny through the windshield. He'd found the comic book in his backpack and was reading by the interior light, trying to pretend everything was normal. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the rest stop building. The face staring back was unfamiliar, hollow-eyed, sharper somehow, like the softness had been scraped away in the hours since she had opened that pink eviction notice. Someone they can't find. Rachel Morgan climbed back into the SUV, started the engine, and drove into the night. The motel was the kind of place that asked no questions. Single story, paint peeling off the exterior walls in long strips, neon sign flickering vacancy in pink letters that buzzed like dying insects. Rachel paid cash for 2 nights, signed the register with a name she invented on the spot, Sarah Mitchell, and carried Danny to room 12 at the far end of the building. Inside smelled like cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. The carpet was brown with stains that might have been there since the 70s, but the lock worked, the beds were clean enough, and no one had followed them. Danny collapsed onto the nearest bed without taking off his shoes. Rachel sat beside him, pulled the burner phone from her pocket, and stared at the number written on her palm. The ink had smudged slightly from sweat and cold. She dialed. 3 rings. Then a woman's voice, clipped and alert despite the hour. "Who is this?" Rachel's throat felt tight. "Robert Hayes gave me your number. My name is..." She stopped. Remembered Hayes's warning. "I need help." A pause. Then the voice came back, softer but still cautious. "Robert doesn't give out this number unless it's serious. Where are you?" Rachel glanced at the window, the parking lot beyond. "Somewhere between Seattle and Portland. I don't know the town." The woman on the other end took a breath. "I'm Laura Chen. Robert mentioned you might call. He said you found something. Something that shouldn't exist anymore." Rachel's hand tightened on the phone. "A bunker. Under my uncle's cabin. Gold bars. Documents stamped classified. Project Cobalt." The silence that followed was different, heavier. When Laura spoke again, her voice carried a weight Rachel hadn't heard before. "How much gold?" Rachel thought of the crates, the bars lined up in rows. "I don't know, millions, maybe more." Laura exhaled slowly. "Robert was right. If you found what I think you found, You're holding a bomb, and the people who buried it will do anything to keep it buried. Rachel looked at Danny, curled up now, eyes closed but breathing too fast for sleep. They already came. 3 of them. Claimed they were Treasury Department. Laura's response was immediate. Where's the gold now? Rachel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Still there, in the bunker, we ran. Another pause. Then Laura's tone shifted, became businesslike. Okay, listen carefully. You can't go back. Not yet. But you also can't just disappear. They'll track you, freeze your accounts, paint you as a thief. You need legitimacy. Rachel pressed her palm against her forehead. How? Laura's answer came without hesitation. You go back. You restore that cabin. You make yourself visible. A grieving niece honoring her uncle's memory, fixing up the family property. You become sympathetic, not suspicious. The idea sounded insane. Rachel's voice cracked slightly. You want me to walk back into a place where armed people broke down my door? Laura's voice was steady, unyielding. I want you to stake your claim before they can erase you, but you won't be alone. I'm coming to you. And I know someone who can help, someone who knew your uncle. The call ended with coordinates for a diner off Highway 101, 2 days from now. Laura would bring the contact. They would make a plan. Rachel sat in the motel room and as dawn light began to creep through the thin curtains. Danny had fallen into real sleep now, his breathing deep and even. She watched him for a long time, memorizing the curve of his cheek, the way his hands curled under his chin like he was protecting something fragile. She thought about Edward's letter. The vault, the gold that wasn't really gold, but evidence. Margaret's diary entry about finishing what they couldn't. If an institution breaks under the weight of truth, it was never strong to begin with. The words formed in her mind unbidden, clear as if someone had spoken them aloud. Rachel stood, walked to the bathroom, and looked at herself in the mirror. The face staring back wasn't the same one that had opened that pink eviction notice. Something had hardened. Something had sharpened. She turned on the faucet and washed the phone number off her palm. The ink swirled down the drain in dark tendrils. She'd already memorized it anyway. 2 days later, Rachel pulled into the gravel parking lot of a diner called the Cedar Stop. The building was low and wide, windows fogged with condensation, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that made the overcast sky seem even darker. Inside, the air smelled like bacon grease and coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. A handful of truckers occupied booths near the front. Rachel scanned the room, spotted a woman sitting alone in the back corner. Early 50s. Short black hair swept back from a sharp face. Glasses perched on her nose. She wore a flannel button-down and jeans. Looked like she could have been a professor or a park ranger or someone's aunt who asked too many questions at Thanksgiving. Laura Chen looked up as Rachel approached, eyes assessing. You must be the one Robert called about. Rachel slid into the booth across from her. Danny climbed in beside his mother, quiet and watchful. Laura's gaze flicked to him briefly, then back to Rachel. Her voice was low, meant only for their table. Before we go further, I need to see proof. Photos, documents, something that tells me this isn't paranoia or a scam. Rachel pulled out her phone, not the burner, her old one she'd kept powered off, and scrolled through the photos she'd taken in the vault. Gold bars, the stamped seals, pages from the classified folders. Edward's handwritten letter. Laura took the phone, studied each image with the focus of someone who knew what to look for. Her expression didn't change, but her breathing did. Slower, more deliberate. She handed the phone back. Project Cobalt. I've been chasing this for 15 years. Most people think it's myth. A conspiracy theory cooked up by Cold War paranoids. Her eyes met Rachel's. But you just proved it's real. A waitress appeared, refilled Laura's coffee without asking, took Rachel's order for toast and juice for Danny. When she left, Laura leaned forward. Her tone was quiet but intense. Here's what you need to understand. This isn't just about hidden gold. It's about a black budget that funded coups, assassinations, regime changes across 3 decades. Money that bought silence and bodies in elections. The people who ran it are either dead or in positions where exposure would destroy them. Rachel's hands were flat on the table, steadying herself. What do I do? Laura pulled a folded map from her jacket pocket, spread it on the table. Red circles marked locations across Washington, Oregon, Montana. There were multiple cache sites. Your uncle's wasn't the only one, but if his records are intact, they could connect everything: names, dates, transfer routes. The kind of evidence that starts congressional hearings. She tapped the map. But you can't just hand this to the FBI or a senator and hope they'll protect you. The system is compromised. You need public pressure first. Media coverage. Witnesses who can't be disappeared. Rachel absorbed this, felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders. You said you know someone who can help. Someone who knew Edward. Laura nodded. Frank Delaney, retired Army Ranger. He and your uncle served together in Vietnam. After Edward moved to that cabin, Frank checked on him every few months. If anyone knows why Edward chose that location, why he stayed, it's Frank. She pulled out a business card, slid it across the table. Handwritten number on the back. He lives 40 minutes from your uncle's property. I already called him. He's expecting you. Danny had been quiet through all of this, sipping orange juice through a straw, eyes moving between the two women. Now he spoke for the first time, voice small but clear. Are we going back there, to the cabin? Rachel looked at her son, at Laura, at the map with its red circles marking places where truth had been buried like radioactive waste. Her answer came steady. Yes, we're going back. Frank Delaney's house sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by second-growth forest and piles of split firewood stacked under blue tarps. A faded green Ford F-150 was parked near a workshop with its door half open, revealing tools and sawhorses inside. The man who emerged when Rachel's Honda pulled up looked exactly like his voice had sounded on the phone. Weathered, solid, gray crew cut, and a face lined by decades of sun and wind. He wore flannel and denim, moved with the deliberate economy of someone who'd learned not to waste motion. He studied Rachel and Danny as they climbed out, then nodded once. You look like your grandmother. She had the same eyes, didn't take shit from anyone. Rachel felt something loosen in her chest. You knew her? Frank gestured toward the house. Knew the whole family, one way or another. Come inside. It's cold. The interior was sparse but clean. Wood stove radiating heat. Shelves lined with books about forestry and military history. Photos on the wall. Young men in combat fatigues. Faces serious. Somewhere green and humid. That wasn't Washington. Frank poured coffee without asking. Set out milk and sugar. Danny wandered to the photos, studying them with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered. Frank settled into a worn armchair. Laura told me what you found. The vault, the gold, Edward's letter. Rachel wrapped her hands around the mug, grateful for the warmth. Did you know? About what he was guarding? Frank's eyes were steady, unflinching. Not the details, but I knew he was carrying something heavy, something that kept him isolated out there for 70 years. He paused. Edward and I went through hell together overseas. When we came back, I started a logging business, got married, had kids. Normal life. Edward took a different path. He stood, crossed to a wooden chest near the window, and pulled out a photo album, sat back down and opened it across his knees. This is your uncle in 1948, right after he married Margaret. The photo showed a young man in a suit that didn't quite fit, standing beside a woman in a simple white dress. Both were smiling, but Edward's eyes held something distant, like part of him was already looking toward a future he couldn't explain. Frank turned pages. They built that cabin together, with their own hands. Margaret planted a garden. Edward installed every window, carved the trim himself. It was beautiful. He looked up. Then something changed. Around 2010, Edward stopped caring, stopped maintaining it. After Margaret died, he just let it rot. Rachel thought of the journal entries, the fresh supplies in the pantry. Someone's been there recently. The pantry was stocked, expiration dates from this year. Frank's jaw tightened. That'd be the management company Hayes hired, but I wouldn't trust them. If word got out about what's in that bunker, people would have come looking. Danny appeared at Rachel's elbow, holding one of the photos. Is this the same house? It looks different. The image showed the cabin as it must have been in its prime. Sage green paint, white trim, stone chimney without cracks, garden blooming in the foreground. Frank's voice softened. That's how Edward wanted it remembered. how Margaret deserved it to be remembered. He looked at Rachel directly. If you're going back, you need to bring it back to this. Not just for legitimacy, for them. Rachel stared at the photo, at the version of the cabin that had existed before secrets and silence had let it crumble. I don't know how to do that. I'm a waitress, not a carpenter. Frank stood, set the album aside. Then I'll teach you, and I'll help. But we do this right. We restore it like they built it, with care, with respect, like it matters. The work began 3 days later. Frank arrived at the cabin with his truck bed full of lumber, tools, boxes of nails and screws. Rachel and Danny had spent the previous day clearing debris from the porch, pulling out rotten boards that crumbled like cork under their hands. Laura came too, her car loaded with cameras and recording equipment. Document everything, before and after. If this becomes public, you need proof of what you're doing and why. Frank stood on the porch, hands on his hips, surveying the damage. We'll start here. New cedar boards, proper footings, then windows. Roof can wait till we've got the structure sound. Rachel had never swung a hammer for anything more complicated than hanging pictures. But Frank was patient, methodical. He showed her how to measure twice, how to hold the nail steady, how to drive it in 3 clean strikes instead of 10 sloppy ones. Her first board split. Her second went in crooked. By the third, she was getting the rhythm. Danny helped where he could, holding boards steady, sorting nails by size, sweeping sawdust. Frank taught him to read a level, how to check if something was plumb. The boy absorbed it all with the same focused intensity he brought to math homework. Laura set up a laptop in what had been the living room, now cleared of debris and dust. She downloaded the photos from Rachel's phone, began cross-referencing the documents against archives and declassified records. 3 weeks passed in a blur of sawdust and sweat. The front porch took shape first, new cedar boards planed smooth, white paint applied in careful strokes. Frank showed Rachel how to cut mitered corners, how to countersink screws so they wouldn't split the wood. They replaced windows next. Frank had sourced vintage glass from a salvage yard, panes that matched the originals. Each one fit into frames Rachel had sanded and repaired, her hands developing calluses that felt like small victories. The stone fireplace required repointing. Frank mixed mortar, while Rachel chipped out the old crumbling stuff. Danny hauled buckets of water from the well, his arms getting stronger with each trip. Inside, oak floors emerged from beneath layers of grime. Rachel rented a sander, spent 2 days on her knees pushing it back and forth until the grain showed through, honey-colored and beautiful. Frank applied the finish in long, even strokes that made the wood glow. The kitchen needed the most work. Cabinets rebuilt, counters replaced. But Frank insisted on keeping the vintage style. No modern updates, just restoration to what Margaret would have recognized. Rachel found herself thinking of the diary entries as she worked. Margaret's careful descriptions of their life here. The garden, the chickens they'd kept, the simple contentment of building something with your hands. Each evening after Frank went home and Danny fell asleep exhausted in the bedroom they'd made habitable, Rachel sat by the fireplace, now functional, smoke drawing properly through the clean chimney, and read more of Edward's journals. One entry from 1975 stood out. Saw them again today. Same car on the ridge. They think I don't notice. Margaret asked if everything was okay. I lied. Some lies protect the people you love. Rachel closed the journal, stared into the flames. The cabin was transforming. Walls that had been water-stained were now painted a soft cream. The ceiling, once sagging, was braced and level. Windows let in light that hadn't touched these rooms in years. But underneath, the vault remained. The gold stayed where Edward had left it. The documents waited in their folders like grenades with pins half pulled. On the 21st day, Rachel was on the roof replacing shingles when she heard a vehicle approach. She climbed down carefully, found a silver sedan parked beside Frank's truck. A man in a dark suit stepped out, carrying a clipboard. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of smooth face that had never seen hard labor. His voice was pleasant, professional. Miss Morgan, I'm David Chen, building inspector. We've received a complaint about unpermitted renovation work. Rachel felt ice in her stomach. I pulled permits. Frank has them inside. The inspector smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm sure you did, but there are some concerns about historical preservation requirements, environmental impact assessments. I'll need to conduct a full inspection. Frank appeared on the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. Everything's legal. I've got the permits right here. He handed over a folder. The inspector flipped through it slowly, too slowly. These appear to be in order. However, I'm still required to conduct the inspection. And I'm afraid I'll need to red tag the property pending review. Rachel's hands clenched at her sides. Red tag? What does that mean? The inspector pulled out a form, began filling it out. It means you'll need to vacate within 48 hours while we complete our assessment. Standard procedure. Frank's voice went flat, dangerous. There's nothing standard about this. Who filed the complaint? The inspector didn't look up. That's confidential, but I suggest you comply. Violations can result in significant fines. He attached the red tag to the door frame, turned, and walked back to his car without another word. Rachel watched him drive away, her vision narrowing to a single point of rage and clarity. They're using the system against us. Frank nodded slowly. Victor Brennan's nephew couldn't buy you out. Now they're trying bureaucracy. Laura appeared in the doorway, phone in hand. I just got word. The inspector's report was requested by a law firm in Seattle. Same firm a Thomas Caldwell works for. Rachel stared at the red tag fluttering in the breeze, at the cabin that was finally coming back to life, at everything they'd built over 3 weeks of brutal, honest work. Her voice came out harder than she'd ever heard it. We're not leaving. That evening, Frank made calls. Within 2 hours, vehicles began arriving. An elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson from the hardware store in town, where Rachel had been buying supplies. She brought her husband and 3 neighbors. A retired contractor who'd worked with Frank years ago. He brought his son and tools. A reporter from a local newspaper, young and eager, who'd heard about the restoration project and wanted to cover it. They gathered on the newly finished porch as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Mrs. Patterson spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived in these mountains for 70 years. Edward Morgan was a good man, quiet, kept to himself, but good. When my husband broke his leg in '93, Edward showed up with firewood every week till spring. Never asked for anything back. Others nodded, shared their own stories, small kindnesses, acts of neighborliness that Edward had never advertised, never expected recognition for. The contractor pulled out the red tag, studied it. I've been reviewing your permits. Everything's legitimate. This inspector's crooked. The reporter was taking notes, camera in hand. If this is harassment by developers trying to force you out, that's a story, a good one. Mrs. Patterson crossed her arms. We're not letting them steal this place. Not from Edward's family. Rachel felt something shift inside her chest. For weeks, she'd been thinking of this as her burden, her fight. But standing here surrounded by people who'd shown up simply because it was right, she understood something fundamental. Truth didn't live in vaults. It lived in moments like this, in ordinary people refusing to look away. The following morning, a white news van from a regional station pulled up. The story had spread, lone mother restoring family cabin, facing down powerful interests. It wasn't the full truth, not yet, but it was enough to make them visible. Frank was right. Legitimacy was armor. Rachel gave an interview on the porch, Danny standing beside her. She talked about Edward, about Margaret, about wanting to honor their memory. The reporter asked about the red tag. Rachel showed it to the camera. That night, the story aired on the 6 o'clock news. By morning, it had been picked up by stations in Seattle and Portland. Victor Brennan would have seen it, would have known his quiet pressure campaign had backfired. 2 days later, the building inspector returned with a sheepish apology. The complaint had been withdrawn. The red tag was lifted. Work could continue. But Rachel knew this wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. That evening, after the others had left and Danny was asleep upstairs in the room they'd finished for him, Rachel sat with Frank and Laura at the kitchen table. Laura spread out a new set of documents. While you were building, I was digging. Found something interesting in Montana land records. She pointed to a map. There's another site, similar to this one. Same period, same bureaucratic footprint. And guess who owns the mineral rights to the land around it? Rachel looked at the name highlighted in yellow. Brennan Development, LLC. Laura continued, voice tight with controlled excitement. He's not just covering up the past, he's profiting from it. Those cache sites were chosen for their isolation, but also their geology. Rare earth minerals, resources that are worth billions now. Frank leaned forward. So he wants this property for the minerals. Laura nodded. And if the Project Cobalt story breaks, if investigations start, his development projects get frozen. He loses everything. Rachel stared at the map, at the pattern emerging. We need those other documents, the ones that were stolen. Laura's eyes narrowed. What documents? Rachel explained about the break-in she'd discovered on her first night back. Margaret's trunk had been ransacked. Several journals were missing. Frank swore quietly. Why take journals? The gold's more valuable. Rachel shook her head. Margaret wrote about everything. Edward might have kept secrets, but she noticed things. Wrote them down, dates, names, conversations she overheard. Laura stood abruptly. If Thomas Caldwell took them, they'd be at his office. Law firms keep everything locked up tight. Rachel's voice was steady. Then we go get them. This drive to Seattle took 4 hours. Laura drove, Rachel rode shotgun, Frank stayed behind with Danny. The city rose up against Puget Sound in layers of glass and steel and old brick, rain turning everything to mercury in the streetlights. Thomas Caldwell's law firm occupied the 15th floor of a building downtown. Laura parked 3 blocks away, turned to Rachel. Her voice was measured, serious. We're not breaking in. Understand? That makes you a criminal. But if we can get access legitimately, if someone lets us in, that's different. Rachel nodded. They'd discussed the plan during the drive. Simple, audacious, possibly stupid. The cleaning crew arrived at 8 p.m. Laura approached the supervisor, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and efficient movements. They spoke in Spanish for several minutes. Laura gestured to Rachel to the building. Money changed hands, not much. $50. The supervisor looked at Rachel directly. 5 minutes. I saw nothing. They took the service elevator. The law offices were dark, empty. Laura had gloves for both of them, LED flashlights with red filters that wouldn't trigger motion sensors. Thomas Caldwell's office was at the end of a hallway lined with names etched on brass plates. The door was locked, but Laura produced a lockpick set with the casual competence of someone who'd done this before. Inside, the office smelled like expensive leather and furniture polish. Diplomas on the wall, photos of Caldwell shaking hands with politicians, corporate executives, people whose faces Rachel recognized from news coverage. Laura went straight to the filing cabinets. Locked. She picked those too. Rachel searched the desk, tried the drawers. The bottom one stuck. She pulled harder, heard something shift inside. Behind the drawer was a small safe, set into the wall. Combination lock. Rachel stared at it, mind racing. Margaret's birthday. Edward had written about it in his journal. April 17th, 1925. She tried the combination. 041725. The safe opened. Inside were 3 leather-bound journals, covers worn smooth. Margaret's handwriting on the first page of each. And a folder labeled Morgan Property, Acquisition Strategy. Rachel's hands shook as she pulled everything out. Laura appeared beside her with a camera, photographing each page rapidly. The first journal entry Rachel saw made her breath stop. May 3rd, 1963. 2 men visited today. Edward sent me to town, but I watched from the woods. They talked about eliminating witnesses, Edward argued. Said he'd kept his word, deserved to be left alone. One man, nameplate said V. Brennan, told Edward, "You're not alone. You have a wife. Think about that." Laura kept photographing. Rachel kept reading, each entry a small detonation in her understanding. The acquisition folder contained geological surveys showing mineral deposits worth $40 million beneath Edward's property. Development plans, investor lists, a timeline, acquire property Q4 2024, begin mining Q1 2025. Laura finished photographing, grabbed Rachel's arm. We need to go, now. They replaced everything exactly as they'd found it. Locked the safe, locked the filing cabinets, locked the office door, took the service elevator down. The cleaning supervisor nodded once as they passed. Outside, rain had turned heavy. They ran for the car, slid inside soaking wet. Laura started the engine, pulled into traffic. Neither spoke for several blocks. Then Rachel's voice broke the silence. He threatened her. Brennan threatened Margaret to keep Edward quiet. Laura's hands were tight on the wheel. And now we can prove it. The journals, the acquisition plan, the timeline, it all connects. Rachel stared out at the rain-slicked streets, at a city full of people who had no idea what kind of rot existed in its foundations. How do we use this? Laura's expression was grim. Carefully. Brennan's not just covering up history, he's orchestrating a future built on it. When we expose him, we expose an entire network. They drove through the night, arrived back at the cabin as dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains. Frank was on the porch, Danny asleep in a chair wrapped in a blanket. He stood when he saw them. His voice was quiet. Did you find them? Rachel nodded, too exhausted for words. Frank looked at the cabin, at the work they'd done. 80% complete now, the exterior painted sage green, Margaret's favorite color according to her diary. The interior warm and livable. The garden plot marked out for spring planting. He turned back to Rachel. Then it's time to finish this. All of it. Over the next week, they completed the restoration. The last of the trim went up around the windows. The stone chimney was repointed to perfection. Frank installed a hand-carved sign above the door. Morgan Homestead, Estenin, 1949. Rachel hung the photograph of Edward and Margaret from 1950 above the fireplace, in the exact spot where it had been in the old photo Frank had shown her. The cabin glowed. Mrs. Patterson brought flowers from her greenhouse, helped Rachel plant them around the porch. The reporter came back, filmed the transformation, before and after. Ruin to resurrection. Danny made a birdhouse in Frank's workshop, using the lathe with careful concentration. He painted it sage green to match the cabin, hung it from the porch eave. On the day they finished, Rachel stood in the garden plot with her hands in the soil, preparing it for vegetables they'd plant when weather warmed. She thought about Margaret's diary, the simple life they'd built here, the love that had endured even when secrets tried to smother it. A black SUV appeared on the logging road. Rachel stood slowly, wiped her hands on her jeans. Frank emerged from the workshop, moved to stand beside her. Laura came out of the cabin, phone already in her hand, recording. 3 men in tactical gear stepped out. Not police uniforms, not government insignia. Private contractors wearing body armor and carrying themselves like people who'd done this work in countries with different rules. The lead contractor was older, maybe 45, with a scar across his jaw and eyes that had seen the things worth forgetting. He stopped 10 feet from Rachel. His voice was professionally neutral. Miss Morgan, Mr. Victor Brennan has authorized me to deliver a final offer. $500,000 for this property. Immediate transfer, no contingencies. Rachel didn't move. It's not for sale. The contractor's expression didn't change. Mr. Brennan anticipated that response. He wants you to understand that legal channels have been exhausted. Further resistance will be viewed as hostile. Frank stepped forward. Armed trespass on private property. Leave now or I call the sheriff. The contractor's eyes flicked to Frank, assessed him in a heartbeat. Former military, still capable. Sheriff's 40 minutes away. A lot can happen in 40 minutes. Laura raised her phone higher, made sure the camera was visible. This is being live streamed. Anything that happens here is recorded. Public. Permanent. The contractor glanced at the phone, at Laura, at the cabin behind them with its fresh paint and obvious care. He pulled out his own phone, spoke briefly into it. A pause. Then he nodded, put the phone away. His voice was quieter now, almost regretful. Mr. Brennan says you're making this harder than it needs to be. Rachel's voice came steady, clear. Tell Mr. Brennan that some things aren't for sale. Not the land, not the truth, not my family's honor. The contractor studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, gestured to his men. They climbed back into the SUV. Before he got in, the lead contractor turned back. This isn't over. Brennan doesn't give up. Ever. The SUV reversed down the logging road, disappeared into the trees. Rachel stood in the garden as her heart slowly stopped hammering. Danny appeared on the porch, eyes wide. His voice was small. Are they coming back? Rachel walked to him, knelt down, put her hands on his shoulders. Maybe, but we're not leaving. This is our home now, and we defend what's ours. That night, after Frank went home and Danny fell asleep, Rachel and Laura sat at the kitchen table with laptops open and coffee growing cold. Laura pulled up the folder of photographs from Caldwell's office. We have everything now. The journals, the acquisition plans, the geological surveys, direct evidence of Brennan's current operations tied to historical crimes. Rachel looked at the screen, at Margaret's handwriting describing threats made 70 years ago, at development plans worth hundreds of millions built on land soaked in silence and fear. Her voice was quiet but absolute. What's the next step? Laura began typing. We go public, but not piecemeal, all at once, coordinated release across multiple platforms. Newspapers, broadcasters, online investigative journals. Make it too big to suppress, too documented to deny. Rachel nodded slowly. How long? Laura checked her watch. 72 hours. I need to coordinate with partners, prepare the full documentation package, establish mirror sites in case primary servers get attacked. She looked up at Rachel. Once we do this, there's no going back. Brennan will come at you with everything. Lawyers, private investigators, media smears. He'll try to destroy your credibility before the facts can speak for themselves. Rachel stood, walked to the fireplace where Edward and Margaret's photo hung. Young, hopeful, building something they believed would last. She thought about the cabin around her, every board replaced with her own hands, every nail driven with care. The way Danny's laugh now echoed through rooms that had been silent for years. She turned back to Laura. Then we make sure the facts are louder than any lie he can tell. Laura smiled, tired but fierce. We'll need you to go on record. Full testimony, your face, your voice, your story. Rachel's hands were steady. I'm ready. Outside, snow began to fall. Soft, silent, covering the logging road, the garden plot, the roof they had repaired together. Inside, the cabin was warm. The fireplace crackled. Light glowed in windows that had been dark for too long. And underneath it all, in the vault beneath their feet, the truth waited with the patience of stone. The upload began at 3 in the morning. Laura had synchronized everything, mirror sites in Germany, Canada, the UK, South Africa. Each server hummed with the same payload of scanned documents, authenticated photographs, Rachel's written testimony, and the damning acquisition files from Caldwell's office. Rachel sat at the kitchen table watching progress bars crawl across Laura's laptop screen. Danny slept upstairs. Frank dozed in the armchair by the fireplace, one eye cracked open every few minutes to check the windows. At 3:47 a.m., the first site went live. Laura's article dropped simultaneously across 4 major investigative journalism platforms. The Cobalt Vault, how the U.S. government lost $150 in gold and buried the truth for 70 years. By 4 a.m., the Washington Post had picked it up. By 5, the New York Times. At 6, as dawn broke gray over the Cascades, network morning shows were leading with it. Rachel's phone, the burner that only 3 people knew existed, rang. Robert Hayes, voice rough with sleep, and something that might have been pride. Rachel, you're about to become very famous. Are you ready? She looked around the cabin they'd rebuilt, at the photo of Edward and Margaret above the fireplace, at the floor she'd sanded with her own bleeding hands. I stopped being ready weeks ago. Now I'm just committed. Hayes made a sound that could have been a laugh. Good, because Brennan's already moving. His lawyers filed an injunction 20 minutes ago, trying to block publication. It won't work. Too many sources, too many jurisdictions, but it tells you he's panicking. The call ended. Rachel walked to the window, watched the forest lighten by degrees. Somewhere out there, in offices with leather, furniture, and expensive art, men were making phone calls, activating networks, preparing counterattacks. Let them come. By noon, Rachel's face was on every news channel. Not her current face. They'd used the photo from her waitress job ID, the one where she looked tired and defeated and exactly like someone who could be dismissed. The chyron beneath read, whistleblower or opportunist. The question mark did all the work. At 2 p.m., Victor Brennan held a press conference from Zurich. Laura pulled up the live stream. Rachel watched a man in his 70s, silver hair, perfectly styled, suit that probably cost more than Rachel's car. He stood behind a podium bearing the crest of some international finance institute, flanked by lawyers whose expressions suggested they'd been practicing neutrality in mirrors. Brennan's voice was grandfatherly, concerned, tinged with disappointment. Miss Morgan is a troubled individual, exploiting a family tragedy for financial gain. My heart goes out to her son, who's being used as a prop in this charade. Rachel's hands clenched. Brennan continued, producing documents with a magician's flourish. We have psychiatric evaluations showing a history of instability, financial records proving she was facing eviction, desperate for money. The gold she claims to have found? Stolen federal property. She's not a whistleblower. She's a thief. The psychiatric evaluation appeared on screen. Rachel stared at it, recognized nothing. Not the doctor's name, not the clinic, not a single session she'd supposedly attended. Laura was already typing furiously. It's a forgery, has to be, but it'll play well to people who want to believe you're lying. Frank leaned forward. Can we prove it's fake? Laura's smile was sharp as broken glass. Already on it, I know someone who can. Dr. Catherine Voss arrived 36 hours later in a rental sedan, trunk full of equipment that looked like it belonged in a crime lab. She was in her 60s, gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, eyes that missed nothing behind wire-rimmed glasses. She set up in the cabin's living room, transforming it into a temporary laboratory. Microscopes, spectrometers, chemical reagents in labeled bottles. Her voice was clipped, efficient. I've been authenticating documents for 30 years, testified in 43 trials. If Brennan's evaluation is forged, I'll prove it. If your uncle's documents are fake, I'll prove that too. Rachel handed over everything. The journals, the classified folders, the photos of gold bars with their stamped serial numbers. Dr. Voss worked for 72 hours straight, sleeping in 3-hour shifts on the couch, surviving on coffee and the sandwiches Danny made with solemn concentration. On the third day, she called everyone to the table. The reports spread before them looked like evidence in a murder trial. Chemical analyses, paper composition studies, ink spectroscopy results, typewriter font matching from government machines that hadn't existed since 1964. But Voss tapped the psychiatric evaluation Brennan had presented. This was printed last week on a laser printer. The paper's manufactured by Domtar, a company that didn't exist until 2007. The letterhead claims to be from Cedar Valley Mental Health Clinic, which closed in '98. The doctor who supposedly signed it died in 2003. She slid that aside, picked up one of Edward's journals. This, however, is genuine. Paper manufactured between 1948 and 1952 based on fiber composition. Ink consistent with Parker fountain pens from that era. Age-appropriate oxidation and foxing. Handwriting analysis shows consistent pressure and flow over decades, which is impossible to fake. Laura was recording every word. Dr. Voss continued, pulling out photos of the gold bars. I contacted the Federal Reserve. These serial numbers match bars minted in 1952 at the Philadelphia facility. Metallurgical isotopic signature confirms government origin. There's no possible way these could be modern forgeries or private castings. Rachel felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since Brennan's press conference. So we can prove he lied. Dr. Voss's expression was grim satisfaction. We can prove he committed fraud. Fabricated evidence. That's a federal crime. The counter press conference happened that afternoon. Laura had arranged for a neutral venue, a community center in Olympia, with enough space for cameras and reporters, but not so official it looked staged. Rachel wore jeans and a flannel shirt borrowed from Frank. Deliberate authenticity against Brennan's polished performance. Dr. Voss presented her findings with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing a procedure. Charts appeared on the screen behind her, showing paper composition, ink analysis, isotopic signatures. When she finished, she removed her glasses and looked directly into the cameras. I stake my professional reputation on this conclusion. Every document Miss Morgan has provided is authentic. Every document Mr. Brennan presented to discredit her is fraudulent. This isn't a matter of opinion. This is established scientific fact. Rachel stepped to the microphone. Her hands were steady. Her voice carried. Victor Brennan wants you to believe I'm unstable, desperate, criminal. He's counting on you to doubt a waitress over a former deputy secretary. But here's what he can't explain. If I'm lying, why did his nephew offer me money to leave before I ever went inside that cabin? Why did building inspectors show up the moment we started restoring it? Why did armed contractors threaten my family? She paused, let the questions hang. The truth doesn't need threats. It doesn't need forgeries. It just needs daylight. The media tide turned within hours. Cable news panels dissected Brennan's fabricated evidence. Legal analysts discussed potential charges. The hashtag had Cobalt Vault trended globally. And then the subpoena arrived. A federal marshal delivered it personally, polite but formal. Rachel was ordered to testify before the Senate Oversight Committee in 7 days. Laura read it over Rachel's shoulder. This is good. Public testimony under oath, with media coverage. They can't bury you if everyone's watching. Frank was less optimistic. Senate committees can be bought. Who's running this one? Laura pulled up the committee roster on her laptop. Her expression shifted. Senator Richard Holbrook, chair of oversight. Something in her tone made Rachel lean closer. What about him? Laura's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up files she'd been compiling for weeks. I've been tracking financial connections. Brennan's network uses shell companies, layers of legal separation. But there are patterns. Wire transfers, campaign donations. She turned the screen around. Bank statements, transfer receipts, corporate filings. Holbrook's campaign received $2.4 million between 2018 and 2023 from entities ultimately controlled by Brennan. It's hidden well, 6 layers of LLCs, offshore holding companies. But it's there. Rachel stared at the numbers. So the man who's supposed to investigate is on Brennan's payroll. Laura nodded slowly. He'll try to discredit you during the hearing, make you look unreliable, opportunistic. He'll protect Brennan because he has to. If Brennan falls, Holbrook falls with him. Frank leaned back, arms crossed. Then we expose him too. Laura's smile was dangerous. Exactly. We wait until he attacks Rachel publicly under oath. Then we drop the financial records. Show everyone that his questions aren't oversight, they're defense of his benefactor. Rachel absorbed this, felt the weight of what they were planning, going after a sitting senator, making an enemy of the entire machinery that protected men like Brennan. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. What if it's not enough? What if they close ranks? Laura met her eyes. Then at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have spoken. Silence doesn't protect anyone. It only guarantees that nothing changes. The days before the hearing blurred into preparation. Laura coached Rachel on testimony, how to answer questions directly without giving openings for misinterpretation. Frank taught Danny how to tie fishing flies, a distraction from the tension that vibrated through every conversation. Rachel read Margaret's diaries again, drawing strength from entries about enduring winters, about planting gardens in soil that had seemed too rocky to nurture anything. On the 6th day, they drove to Washington, D.C. The city rose up around them in monuments and marble, power made visible in stone and bronze. Laura had arranged a hotel near Capitol Hill, anonymous and secure. They arrived after dark, too keyed up for sleep. Rachel stood at the window looking out at the illuminated dome in the distance. Danny was curled up in the next bed, finally asleep after an hour of nervous questions. Laura appeared beside her and handed her a glass of water. Tomorrow changes everything. You ready? Rachel thought about the cabin, about boards replaced and floors refinished, about building something with her hands that would outlast her, about Edward and Margaret who'd carried silence like a stone for 70 years. Ready isn't the right word, but I'm here. The hearing chamber was exactly what Rachel had imagined from television. Dark wood, high ceilings, an atmosphere of deliberate gravity. Cameras lined the walls. The press gallery was standing room only. Rachel sat at a long table facing the committee, a microphone in front of her, a name placard reading Rachel Morgan, civilian witness, Project Cobalt disclosure. To her right, Laura Chen sat as her legal advisor. Frank was in the gallery beside Danny, both wearing suits that looked uncomfortable but determined. The committee members filed in. 9 senators, mostly older men, faces Rachel recognized from news coverage, but had never expected to address directly. Senator Richard Holbrook sat in the center chair. Early 60s, distinguished gray at his temples, the kind of face that inspired trust in campaign commercials. He gavelled the session to order. His voice was measured, senatorial. This hearing is called to examine allegations regarding Project Cobalt, a purported Cold War-era operation. Miss Morgan, you've made serious claims. We're here to determine their validity. Rachel raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth. The words felt heavier than any vow she'd ever made. Holbrook began with gentle questions. Her background, her relationship to Edward Morgan, how she came to inherit the property. Rachel answered simply, directly, remembering Laura's coaching. Then his tone shifted, became more pointed. Miss Morgan, you were facing eviction when you received this inheritance. Is that correct? Rachel kept her voice steady. I was struggling financially, yes. Holbrook leaned forward, and discovering valuable gold would certainly solve those struggles, wouldn't it? Laura tensed beside her, but Rachel didn't flinch. The gold was never about solving my problems. It was about understanding what my uncle had guarded for 70 years. Holbrook produced a document, held it up. We have records showing you stole a vehicle, a black SUV registered to a security company, from your property. That's theft, Miss Morgan. Rachel felt her pulse spike but kept her expression calm. I took that vehicle to protect my son from armed men who'd broken into our home. I returned it to local authorities 2 days later. Holbrook's expression suggested skepticism. Convenient timing. You also claim to have found classified documents, yet you've produced only photographs. How do we know you didn't fabricate these? This was the moment. Rachel saw Laura shift slightly, preparation for what came next. Senator, every document has been authenticated by Dr. Catherine Voss, one of the nation's leading forensic document examiners. Her findings are part of the public record. Paper composition, ink analysis, typewriter font matching, all confirm these documents originated between 1946 and 1964. Holbrook waved this away. Expert witnesses can be bought, Miss Morgan. What we need is context, motive. And frankly, your motive seems clear. You needed money. You found a dramatic way to get it. Rachel felt anger rising but channeled it into clarity. Senator, if I'm fabricating this, how do you explain Victor Brennan's nephew offering to buy my property before I'd even been inside the cabin? How do you explain the building inspector who red-tagged legal renovation work? How do you explain armed contractors showing up to threaten us? Holbrook's jaw tightened. I'm asking the questions here. Rachel didn't back down. Then ask this one. Why did Victor Brennan transfer $2.4 million to your campaign through shell companies between 2018 and 2023? The chamber erupted. Journalists surged forward. Cameras flashed. The gavel pounded like thunder. Holbrook's face went red. That's slander! I've never... Laura stood, holding a folder high. Mr. Chairman, we submit financial records linking Senator Holbrook to Victor Brennan's network. Wire transfers, LLC formation documents, bank statements, all authenticated and verified. She walked forward, handed the folder to the committee clerk. Flashbulbs turned the moment into lightning. Holbrook was shouting now, "This is character assassination. I won't..." Another senator, younger, leaned into her microphone. Mr. Chairman, these are serious allegations. We need to review these documents immediately. A third senator, older but with sharp eyes, spoke quietly. Senator Holbrook, perhaps you should recuse yourself from this hearing. Holbrook stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. I've done nothing wrong. This is a setup orchestrated by... Security appeared at the chamber doors. Not Capitol Police in their usual uniforms, but federal marshals in dark suits. The lead marshal approached the dais with a document. Senator Holbrook, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defraud, and accepting bribes in excess of federal limits. The chamber went silent except for camera shutters clicking like mechanical rain. Holbrook looked at the warrant, at the marshals, at Rachel sitting calm and steady at the witness table. His face collapsed into something ugly, desperate. You don't understand what you've done. Brennan will... The marshal cut him off. Senator, you have the right to remain silent. They let him out through a side door. The chamber remained frozen for 3 heartbeats. Then chaos, reporters shouting questions, senators conferring in urgent whispers. staff rushing to contain a situation that had already exploded beyond any container. The acting chair, the younger senator who'd called for recusal, gavelled for order. It took 5 minutes to restore something resembling calm. She turned to Rachel, expression a mix of shock and something that might have been respect. Miss Morgan, I apologize for what you've just witnessed. This committee will reconvene tomorrow under new leadership. Your testimony will be heard in full with the gravity it deserves. Rachel nodded, found her voice. Thank you, Senator. As they filed out, Frank caught up with them in the corridor. His grin was fierce. That was the damnedest thing I've ever seen. Danny looked up at Rachel with wide eyes. Did you just get a senator arrested? Rachel knelt down, put her hands on his shoulders. I just told the truth. The rest happened because other people chose to hide it. Laura was already fielding calls, interviews, requests. The story had gone nuclear. Senator arrested during hearing. Whistleblower exposes corruption network. The questions that had seemed impossible to answer were now being asked by everyone. That evening in the hotel room, Rachel watched the news coverage with something approaching disbelief. Her face filled screens across the nation. Analysts dissected what it meant. Legal experts discussed the implications. One commentator, a former federal prosecutor, spoke with careful precision. What we witnessed today isn't just about Project Cobalt. It's about institutional rot when a senator tasked with oversight is himself implicated in the very conspiracy he's supposed to investigate. That reveals a system failure of catastrophic proportions. Rachel turned off the television, sat in the quiet darkness. Danny was asleep, finally, exhausted by the day's intensity. Frank appeared in the doorway. Can't sleep either? She shook her head. Feels like if I sleep, I'll wake up and it'll have all been a dream. Or a nightmare. Frank sat down in the chair across from her. What you did today, speaking truth to power like that, Edward would have been proud. Hell, I'm proud. Rachel looked at him. This man who'd helped her rebuild more than just a cabin. I keep thinking about Margaret, how she lived with Edward's secret for 60 years. Never pushed, never demanded answers, just trusted. Frank nodded slowly. That was her choice. But you get to make a different one. You get to finish what they couldn't. The hearing reconvened the next day under new leadership. The questions were different now, respectful, seeking genuine understanding rather than gotcha moments designed to discredit. Rachel told the full story, finding the bunker, the gold bars with their federal stamps, Edward's letter explaining his role as unwitting guardian of a black budget operation, Margaret's diaries documenting threats and surveillance, the recent attempts to force her off the property. She showed photographs, read excerpts from journals, presented DeVos's forensic analysis. When she finished, the chamber was silent. Then the acting chair spoke, voice heavy with something that sounded like remorse. Miss Morgan, on behalf of this committee and the United States Senate, I apologize. Your family was used, threatened, and then forgotten by a system that should have protected them. That Edward Morgan carried this burden alone for 7 decades is a stain on our national conscience. Rachel felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not yet. The hearing lasted 3 more hours. Other witnesses testified. Dr. Voss with her scientific findings, Robert Hayes with legal documentation, even Mrs. Patterson from the hardware store who spoke about Edward's quiet dignity over decades. By the end, 4 more officials had been subpoenaed. 2 resigned before the day was out. Swiss authorities announced cooperation on extradition proceedings for Victor Brennan. The Senate voted unanimously to issue a formal apology to Edward Morgan's estate and establish a $50 million victim compensation fund for families affected by Project Cobalt operations. Rachel walked out of the Capitol building into cold November air. Danny grabbed her hand, squeezed tight. His voice was small but proud. You did it. Rachel looked up at the sky, gray and promising snow. We did it. All of us. 1 year later. The dedication ceremony for the Edward and Margaret Morgan Historical Site drew over 300 people. The cabin stood perfect in autumn light, sage green paint glowing against the backdrop of evergreens, just beginning their seasonal shift toward dormancy. The garden Rachel and Danny had planted that first spring was harvesting now. Tomatoes, squash, beans climbing poles, exactly as Margaret's diary had described. Flowers lined the pathways, deliberate beauty in a landscape that had once been defined by silence. An interpretive center occupied the converted workshop where Frank had taught Danny to use the lathe. Inside, glass cases displayed Edward's journals, Margaret's diaries, photographs spanning 7 decades. The vault itself was accessible via guided tour, the gold bars now replaced by museum-quality replicas, the originals transferred to the Smithsonian as part of the historical record. The governor of Washington stood at a podium, speaking about truth and accountability, and the ordinary people who carried both when institutions failed. Rachel stood beside him, wearing a simple dress, her hands showing calluses that would never fully fade. Frank Delaney cut the ribbon with Rachel and Danny, his grin wide enough to crack his weathered face. The crowd applauded, cameras captured the moment, and then people flooded forward to tour the site they'd read about in headlines. Rachel found herself pulled into conversations, answering questions, accepting thanks from strangers who'd driven hours to see what resurrection looked like. A veteran who'd served with Edward decades ago, eyes wet as he touched the porch railing. A young journalist working on Cold War history who asked permission to include the story in her dissertation. A family of 4 who wanted their children to understand that courage sometimes looked like patience. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, the crowds thinned. Rachel walked the property alone, checking details the way she did every evening. The new roof holding against autumn rains, the chimney drawing clean, the floors inside gleaming with care. She ended at the garden, knelt in the soil still warm from the day's sun, pulled a few weeds that had crept in overnight. This work never ended, she'd learned. Maintenance was its own form of love. Danny appeared beside her, holding 2 mugs of tea. He'd grown taller over the year, voice just beginning to crack towards something deeper. He sat down on the ground next to her. "Mrs. Patterson says we had 47 visitors today. New record." Rachel accepted the tea, grateful for its warmth. Edward and Margaret would have hated the attention. Danny smiled, but they'd love that people know the truth now. Rachel looked at the cabin, at the light in the windows that had been dark for so long, at the sign Frank had carved and mounted by the entrance. Morgan Homestead, where silence became voice. Her job now was director of the historical site. The salary came from the compensation fund, administered by a nonprofit board that included Laura, Frank, and 3 historians specializing in Cold War operations. Rachel taught carpentry workshops on weekends, showing single mothers and veterans how to build and repair, how manual labor could rebuild more than structures. She'd written a book, The Cobalt Vault, A Granddaughter's Journey to Truth. It had spent 16 weeks on the bestseller list, every dollar of royalties donated to advocacy groups for families affected by classified government operations. Victor Brennan had been extradited 3 months ago. The trial was ongoing, but the evidence was overwhelming. Conspiracy, obstruction, corruption spanning 4 decades. His lawyers were good, but no defense could stand against authenticated documents in a plaintiff who'd rebuilt her life from nothing into something that mattered. Thomas Caldwell had been disbarred. The law firm dissolved. The mining project canceled. The land around the cabin designated a protected historical preserve. Senator Holbrook had pleaded guilty to avoid a longer sentence. 5 years in federal prison, disgrace that would follow him forever. But the victory Rachel held closest wasn't any of those things. It was the letter that had arrived last week, forwarded from the historical site's main office, handwritten on lined paper, the penmanship shaky but legible. "Dear Rachel, you did what I never could. You carried it to the light." The signature was illegible, but the postmark was from a VA hospital in Montana. Rachel suspected it was from one of the men Edward had served with, someone who'd known about the vault and lived with that knowledge for 50 years. The letter sat in her pocket now, folded small. She touched it sometimes, reminded herself that some silences ended not with explosions, but with quiet recognition between people who understood the weight of carrying truth alone. Danny finished his tea, set the mug aside. "Do you think Great-Uncle Edward and Margaret are happy now?" Rachel looked at the cabin one more time. Every board replaced, every window restored, every detail honored. The place they'd built with hope and watched crumble under the weight of secrets they couldn't speak. "I think they're home, finally." Danny nodded, satisfied with this answer. He stood, headed back toward the cabin where Frank was probably starting a fire in the stone fireplace, preparing for the evening chill. Rachel stayed in the garden a moment longer. The sky was turning colors she'd learned to name over the year: ember and ash, salmon bleeding into indigo. Birds called from the forest edge, settling into roosting spots. The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke and earth preparing for winter. She thought about the pink eviction notice that had started everything, about standing in a hallway with a split grocery bag and a son who'd learned too young not to show fear, about the moment she'd opened Edward's letter in a vault beneath the ground and understood that inheritance was more than objects. It was the choice to finish what others had left incomplete. The vault had been opened, the truth had been told, but more than that, a home had been restored, a family had been honored, a mother and son had found purpose in something larger than the survival. Not in gold, not in revenge, but in remembering those who couldn't speak, and making sure their silence became a voice that would never fade. Rachel stood, brushed dirt from her knees, and walked back to the cabin. Light spilled from the windows in golden rectangles across the darkening ground. Inside, she could hear Danny laughing at something Frank had said, their voices warm and alive in rooms that had held nothing but ghosts for too long. She climbed the porch steps, ran her hand along the railing they'd built together, pushed open the door that no longer creaked, and stepped into the warmth of home.